Midnight descends upon the ancient Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra monastery, a sprawling complex of golden-domed cathedrals and subterranean caves perched above the Dnipro River. For nearly 1,000 years, this has been the spiritual heart of Kievan Rus, the cradle of Eastern Slavic Orthodoxy. Inside the dimly lit Dormition Cathedral, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax and frankincense. The quiet, resonant chanting of monks from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or UOC, echoes through the hallowed space. Their voices, steeped in a tradition historically aligned with the Moscow Patriarchate, seem to call out across the centuries, a living link to a shared past. They are praying for peace, for their country, and for the preservation of their sacred home. But just beyond these thick stone walls, a different kind of prayer, a different kind of plea rises into the cold night air. Outside the monastery gates, a crowd has gathered. They are not pilgrims seeking solace, but protesters demanding a reckoning. They hold Ukrainian flags that snap in the wind and placards with stark, uncompromising messages. Their songs are not ancient liturgical hymns, but the national anthem, a defiant assertion of sovereignty. Many of these protesters are members and supporters of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the OCU, a body granted formal independence from Moscow only a few years ago. To them, the monks praying inside are not just keepers of a sacred tradition, but representatives of an institution whose spiritual leader in Moscow, Patriarch Kirill, has offered blessings for the very war that devastates their land. The tension is a palpable, invisible wall between the two groups. It is a profound clash between ancient spiritual allegiance and modern national identity, a conflict where the sacred and the political have become inseparable. This isn't merely a dispute over property rights or ecclesiastical jurisdiction. It is a battle for the very soul of a nation, being forged in the crucible of a brutal war. The Lavra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is more than just a collection of buildings. It is a symbol, a repository of national memory. Founded in 1051 by the monks Anthony and Theodosius, its catacombs hold the relics of over 100 saints. For centuries, pilgrims have journeyed here, seeking healing and divine intercession. To see it become a front line in a cultural and religious war is a source of deep national pain. The Ukrainian government, citing national security concerns and the UOC's historical ties to an aggressor state, has moved to terminate the church's lease on the state-owned Lavra. This has led to dramatic standoffs, with UOC clergy and faithful barricading themselves inside, while OCU supporters and state officials demand they vacate the premises. News archives from recent months are filled with heart-wrenching scenes. An elderly woman, a lifelong UOC parishioner, weeping at the gates, unable to comprehend why her church is being labeled as an enemy entity. A young soldier, home on leave, passionately arguing with a UOC priest, demanding to know why his church hasn't unequivocally severed all ties with the Moscow Patriarchate that sanctions the killing of his comrades. The UOC insists it declared its independence from Moscow in May 2022, shortly after the full-scale invasion began. They argue they are a Ukrainian church, serving Ukrainian people, and that they are being unjustly persecuted by the state in a move that violates religious freedom. Their defenders, both within Ukraine and internationally, warn that these government actions set a dangerous precedent, using the fog of war to settle old scores and enforce a state-approved version of national identity. From their perspective, they are the canonical, historical church, and the OCU is a politically motivated upstart. However, for the OCU and its supporters, the UOC's declaration of independence was a half measure, a cosmetic change that failed to address the fundamental problem, a lingering spiritual and canonical connection, however tenuous, to a hostile power. They point to instances of UOC clergy being investigated for collaboration or spreading pro-Russian narratives. For them, in a time of existential war, there can be no ambiguity. A church in Ukraine must be fully and unequivocally Ukrainian, free from any shadow of Moscow's influence. The Lavra, as the ultimate symbol of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, must therefore belong to the independent Ukrainian Church. This conflict forces a re-examination of faith itself. Is religious identity immutable, a sacred inheritance passed down through generations? Or is it fluid, something that must adapt to the political and moral realities of the present? The chants of the monks inside and the anthems of the protesters outside are both, in their own way, prayers for Ukraine. Yet they represent two vastly different visions of what Ukraine's spiritual future should be. The golden domes of the Lavra reflect the lights of a city under siege, standing as a silent witness to a nation's agonizing struggle to define itself. How did this revered monastic complex, a place of supposed eternal peace, become the epicenter of Ukraine's most profound religious and geopolitical rift? Building on the contested gates of the Lavra, we must trace the historical currents that carved this deep chasm in Ukraine's spiritual landscape. The roots of this schism are not shallow, they run deep into the soil of centuries of political and religious struggle. For much of its history, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the Kyiv Metropolia, existed in a complex orbit around more powerful neighbors. The pivotal moment came in 1686 when, under immense political pressure from the Tsardom of Muscovy, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople transferred jurisdiction of the Kyiv Metropolia to the Moscow Patriarchate. This act, debated by theologians and historians for over 300 years, effectively subordinated the ancient Church of Kyiv to the younger but politically ascendant Church of Moscow. As the Russian Empire expanded, this religious subordination became a key tool of cultural and political assimilation, a process that intensified under the Soviet Union, which brutally suppressed any expression of independent Ukrainian religious life. The Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, which emerged briefly in the 1920s, was systematically liquidated by Stalin, its leaders executed or exiled. The yearning for an independent or autocephalous church never truly died. It was a flickering candle kept alive in the diaspora and in the hearts of those who saw religious independence as inseparable from national sovereignty. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, this flame was reignited. The subsequent decades saw the coexistence of multiple, competing Orthodox jurisdictions in Ukraine, a messy and often fractious reality. There was the UOC, which remained under the Moscow Patriarchate but was granted broad autonomy. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kievan Patriarchate, led by the charismatic and controversial Patriarch Filaret, who broke from Moscow to establish a national church, and the smaller Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. This fractured landscape mirrored the country's own struggle for a stable post-Soviet identity. The situation reached a critical turning point after Russia's annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in Donbass in 2014. The Moscow Patriarchate's open support for Russian expansionism and Patriarch Kirill's close alignment with the Kremlin made the UOC's position increasingly difficult. The idea of Ukraine's soldiers receiving blessings from priests whose ultimate authority resided in the aggressor nation became a source of profound national cognitive dissonance. This political reality provided the final impetus for a decisive break. In 2018, Ukrainian political and religious leaders formally appealed to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, the historical first among equals in the Orthodox world, to grant the Ukrainian Church autocephaly. After months of intense theological and political deliberation, in January 2019, Patriarch Bartholomew signed the Tomos of autocephaly. This historic document formally recognized and established the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, uniting the UOC-KP and the UAOC into a single, canonical, independent national church. This act was a spiritual declaration of independence, sending shockwaves through the entire Orthodox world. The Moscow Patriarchate reacted with fury, immediately severing Eucharistic communion with Constantinople and accusing Patriarch Bartholomew of a schismatic and unlawful intrusion into its canonical territory. They argued that the 1686 transfer was permanent and that the new OCU was an illegitimate, politically engineered entity. This created a global schism, forcing other Orthodox churches around the world to choose sides. As noted by historian Serhii Plokhy in his seminal work, The Gates of Europe, the struggle over religious identity has been a constant theme in Ukrainian history, a proxy for the larger battle between a European and a Eurasian orientation. The Tomos was not just a religious document, it was a profound geopolitical event, pulling Ukraine further out of Moscow's orbit. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, the theological debate became a brutal, life-or-death reality. The sight of Patriarch Kirill describing the war as a metaphysical struggle and bestowing blessings upon Russian troops horrified many within the UOC itself. Parishes began to leave the UOC and join the OCU in droves, especially in communities that had witnessed Russian atrocities firsthand. The spiritual loyalty to Moscow, once a matter of tradition and canon law, was now widely seen as a form of national betrayal. The UOC's attempts to distance itself from Moscow were seen by many as too little, too late. This is the direct line from a 17th century political treaty to a 21st century war, from an ancient ecclesiastical document to the protests at the Lavra gates. Faith has become a frontline, and the language of canon law is now a weapon in an information war. But what are the human consequences when spiritual loyalty is equated with national betrayal? Extending that question of loyalty, we turn our gaze from the grand pronouncements of patriarchs and presidents to the quiet, often agonizing, reality of ordinary Ukrainian believers. The schism is not an abstract theological concept, it is a painful fissure running through villages, communities, and even families. Consider the story of a priest, let's call him Father Mykola, who has served a small rural parish for 30 years under the UOC. He was ordained in a church tied to Moscow, as was his father before him. He has baptized the children, married the young couples, and buried the elders of his village. His parishioners know him not as a political figure, but as their spiritual father. Now, he faces an impossible choice. Local authorities and patriotic activists pressure him to lead his parish into the OCU. They see it as his civic duty. To refuse is to invite suspicion, to be branded a collaborator in the eyes of his neighbors. Yet, for him, the UOC is the church of his ancestors, the one he believes holds true canonical grace. To switch allegiance feels like a betrayal of his vows, a concession to political wins. If he joins the OCU, he risks alienating the older, more traditional members of his flock who are wary of the new church. If he stays, he risks losing the younger generation and being ostracized by the wider community. His dilemma is a microcosm of the spiritual trauma afflicting countless clergy and laypeople. This division is felt acutely within families. Anthropological field notes from a researcher we'll call Dr. Anya Petrova, working in central Ukraine, document these intimate conflicts. She describes Easter dinners where conversations devolve into bitter arguments. A son, a veteran of the war, refuses to attend the same UOC service as his mother, telling her he cannot pray in a church that is silent about its Moscow masters. The mother, in turn, accuses him of abandoning the faith of their family, of mistaking politics for piety. These are not people who have lost their faith. They are people whose faith is being tested in the most profound way imaginable, forced to navigate a landscape where every liturgical choice is a political statement. The very act of worship, meant to bring peace and unity, has become a source of division and pain. The conflict also forces a reinterpretation of shared sacred heritage. The saints whose relics lie in the caves of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, like the chronicler Nestor and the physician Agapitus, are foundational figures for all Eastern Slavs. For centuries, their veneration was a unifying practice. Now, their legacy is contested. Are they Ukrainian saints whose spiritual home is the independent OCU? Or are they saints of a universal orthodoxy, whose custodianship under the UOC should be respected as a matter of historical continuity? The OCU, now holding services in parts of the Lavra, frames their veneration as a reclaiming of national spiritual treasures. The UOC, in turn, accuses the OCU of politicizing the sacred, of turning saints into nationalistic idols. This battle over narrative is crucial as it seeks to define the past in order to control the spiritual future. Can these wounds ever truly heal? The path to reconciliation is fraught with obstacles. For meaningful dialogue to occur, the UOC would need to take steps that unequivocally and permanently sever its institutional and ideological ties to the Moscow Patriarchate, a move many of its more conservative bishops and faithful are still unwilling to make. On the other hand, the OCU and the Ukrainian state must ensure that the transition of parishes is voluntary and not coercive, respecting the principles of religious freedom even amidst the pressures of war. Some theologians and community leaders are trying to bridge the divide, emphasizing a shared faith in Christ that should transcend jurisdictional disputes. They advocate for a bottom-up reconciliation where local communities find ways to coexist and even cooperate, regardless of the declarations from Kyiv or Moscow. But in a nation fighting for its very existence, the call for unity often means rallying around a single national institution. The future of Ukrainian Orthodoxy may not be one of reunification, but of a long, painful process of defining a new normal, a new understanding of Orthodox unity in a fractured world. The prayers rising from Kyiv continue, a testament to a faith that endures even as its earthly institutions are torn asunder.